morning, everyone. Welcome. Welcome. We are going to start in a minute. We'll just wait a little more so that everyone can join us. Good morning and welcome. Hi, everyone. Okay, we're going to start shortly. I'm just going to share a few technical indications with you to launch our webinar. I see that you're joining in a large number. Good morning. Or good afternoon, rather. So I'd say we can start.
Vi do il benvenuto.
Welcome. On my behalf, I'm Lorena Di Maria, Project Manager at Torino Social Impact, and I am the coordinator of the Torino Impact Journalism Initiative. This is a platform as well as an ecosystem to support investments and businesses with a social impact based here in Turin. One of the many projects that we launched about impact economy issues. This is a pathway which is going to explore the role of journalism in the era of impact economy. This is an initiative that we have been building on day by day, thanks to all the different organizations and businesses which are located here, having displayed their interest. We kicked off with the first panel in the month of May at the Book Fair of Turin, with experts at a national and international level, during which we also launched a series of webinars aiming at analyzing from a number of perspectives what the role of impact socialism and journalism might look like with the technical and educational perspective. We continues in June, and today is going to be the second webinar online focused on the different metrics of social impact in journalism. We have international as well as national experts present here, and by the end of the year we are going to share with you further information about the next encounters. This is done in collaboration with the Register of Journalists, which is the collaboration of paramount importance for us, and is supported by the Social Impact Agenda per l'Italia. That's a national network of impact finance chaired by Giovanna Melandri, and Filippo Montesi, Secretary General, is here as a speaker today. So thank you for your patronage. A couple of technical indications. We have interpretation available today, so that you can decide whichever language you wish to follow in by clicking on the language bar below. So you can rather decide to follow in Italian or in English in our case. On top of that, at the end of every intervention, of every speech by our speakers, we have also foreseen a Q&A session. So if you have any questions, any remarks, you can type anything you'd like into the chat below to your right. There is a chat box that you can use. Furthermore, you can also ask questions throughout the webinar, not just at the end, so that we can all ask them once the speakers are done presenting. Thank you very much to our colleagues, Rafael Gianotti from the Stampa, as well as curator of our initiative. Thank you very much to our speakers who are going to share their experience with us today about metrics of social impact in journalism, as well. Paolo Piacenza, journalist and coordinator of redactional activities at the University of Turin, Masters in Journalism, who is going to be our moderator today. Thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon on my side as well, from my side as well. Thank you very much, Lorena. I'd like to thank personally on behalf of the Master in Journalism at the University of Turin, Social Impact, Professor Mario Calderini, my colleague from La Stampa, Rafael Zanotti, Simona Di Giorgio, Grace Di Girolamo, Marolena Di Maria, Raffaello Scalini, and the whole team that organized this course on impact journalism, for having the foresight and the courage to talk about this topic. And I thank you who have chosen to participate in this meeting, and especially our speakers, whom I will introduce to you as we continue, but who are all truly valuable interlocutors. Richard Addy, co-founder at ACAS, Lindsay Green-Barber, founder and principal of Impact Architects, Filippo Montesi, Human Foundation Senior Advisor and Secretary General of the Social Impact Agenda per l'Italia for recently, as well as Vera Pineda, Director of Programs and Impact at the European Journalism Centre. As head of the editorial activities of the Master in Journalism, Giorgia Bocca at the University of Turin, I'm in charge of coordinating the training workshops. For 20 years, since this master degree was created both as a professional and as a trainer, the idea of retracing, of rereading and rewriting the lines of what is the field, the practice and the mission of journalism has been part of the game. 20 years in which crisis, disintermediation, media revolution, post-industrial journalism have been the key words. We remember this text from 2012. So we came to terms with the loss of confidence in the media and their role, and news avoidance. So the way we willingly avoid reading the news. And for students too, the challenge of preparing for a profession like this has increasingly involved a commitment to continuous research. So they have to learn that there is something uncomfortable and sometimes risky about it, which is not a bad thing, quite the contrary, but it remains a commitment to which our profession for too many years, especially in Italy, has offered every resistance, taking refuge in habitual roles and practices, in the certainties of the newspaper machine, in the sentence, business as usual, or the phrase business as usual. And this total change, there are, however, occasionally impressive returns to the origin, as I wish to define that. It seems to me that this is the case with the concept of impact. The concept of impact began to assume relevance relatively recently in the 90s, thanks to the so-called theory of change developed within the Aspen Institute. And it became widespread in the corporate sphere as a tool for assessing the integral impacts of business activities at a social, environmental, and an economic level. Journalism has been coming to terms with this concept in a technical sense for no more than 20 years. Yet it is since media scholars began to assess the influence and role of media on society that we have been talking about media impact, albeit in a non-technical way. Think of Walter Lippmann's writings of over 100 years ago, 1922, but also of the subsequent elaborations from the theory of minimal media effects versus personal influences to the 70s, with writings on the decisive role of the media in agenda setting. It seems to me, however, that the idea of impact should even be traced back to the very birth of journalism. In fact, a crucial moment in the birth of the newspaper's press is connected to the rise of the penny press of the 30s, so 1830s in the States, under the presidency of Andrew Jackson. Back then, newspapers like the New York Sun invented an audience that did not exist before, moving from the press as a technical product for the upper classes to a newspaper for everyone, at least for everyone who could read. From that multiplication of audiences came journalism as an industrial phenomenon, as a business model, but also as a social phenomenon with widespread impact. So today's challenge, that of measuring the impact of journalism, seems to me to take us back to the origin of its mission. Some of the concepts of our guests will talk about here are the result of a recent or even very recent elaborations, such as the study Understanding Journalism Impact, published at the end of 2023 and signed by Ania Schaefin, Andrea Correa de Almeida, Adelina Yankova, Dylan Groves, and one of our speakers today, Lindsay Green Barber. And yet the question of measuring impact has to do precisely with the historical mission of news reporting. And that is why I believe we can't back down as journalists by taking refuge in the convenient idea that talking about impact would turn us into supporters of one specific cause or one specific party. As we learned during the previous steps of this pathway devoted to solutions journalism, talking about the impact of journalism does not mean advocacy, but offering readers, listeners, and users more elements of comparison, more context, and therefore more possibilities to understand, choose, and take a position without us doing it for them. Recently, under the guidance of Professor Alessio Con of the University of Dublin as lead author, Marco Ferrando, Celeste Sata, and I elaborated and published for the Master in Journalism in Turin the first digital news report, Italy 2024. The study that the Reuters Institute of the University of Oxford has been preparing and disseminating for over 10 years, and which is considered the most complete analysis. It was actually presented in mid-June. The most complete analysis, I was saying, of the state of health of the news media on a global level. And for the very first time this year, it was accompanied by an edition that delves into all the Italian data of the report, which you can download from the Master's website. I mention this because one of the most interesting focus points of the report that I dealt with concerns precisely a method for evaluating and improving audience engagement mechanisms, which is the so-called user needs. A method that is the very basis of a series of questions for the Digital News Report 2024. In order to further deepen the analysis of audience needs, the participants were asked how important 8 different elements were to them, which correspond to different needs that can be met through the enjoyment of news. The answers were distributed into 4 macro categories of user needs, meaning knowing, understanding, feeling, and doing. And based on this analysis of the interviews with Italians, it emerged that for a while, knowing something more about the news is still the first need. And this is considered on average to be adequately satisfied by the media. But the real priority on which energies need to be focused more is that of helping the audience to understand, meaning to read or hear, listen to pieces of news that help them better understand topics and events, to have new perspectives on current affairs. So the issue of journalism quality is therefore confirmed as crucial, and specifically in Italy. And these also to recover credibility and therefore trust. As we write in the report, it is on these fronts that work needs to be done to take the media even closer and more capable of speaking to its audience, which, however, must be known better and better in order to be truly satisfied. There's reason we approach today's little journey into impact measurement as a valuable opportunity. And we shall start with the idea of impact itself, We will be held by Filippo Montesi. As I said, he is the senior advisor at the Human Foundation and Secretary General of the Social Impact Agenda for Italy. He has carried out and coordinated numerous impact assessment activities of social innovation projects for investors and social enterprises, working with various international organizations and in different contexts. To him, whom I thank, I first asked to introduce us to the concept of social impact and tell us why it is crucial to measure it, and then give us a brief overview of metrics and potential applications to the field of the news. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Vicenza, for this introduction, and Torino Social Impact for this collaboration. So for us, this is absolutely relevant in terms of social impact agenda per l'Italia. So this is a topic that is not being dealt with enough from our viewpoint, but we do need it in a more systematic way. So this is part of an overall strategy where information plays a crucial role in sustainable development at a national and international level. I was asked for this webinar to talk about impact assessment. Therefore, I shall try and underline, on the one hand, the role of information to reach a set of goals in terms of social value generation and sustainability. And on the other hand, I shall tell you more about the different approaches at hand to enhance the value of this work. I prepared a presentation, so you should be seeing it. As I've just shared my screen, yes. So, a few words about our association to tell you why a finance-based organization should be interested at all in such a topic. Social Impact Agenda per l'Italia includes a number of businesses who deem that finance can play an active role in creating an economy that, on top of variables such as profits, can take into account environmental and social aspects as well. So our association is basically the Italian network within GSG Impacts, an independent organization spread over 70 countries in the global north and south. As you can see, our distribution is quite wide. So this is a community of people and organizations who decided to put this complex topic of social value to the heart of their strategies, both, as I said, in the north and the south of the world. So this is a way to represent this ecosystem. What do we do to promote a different paradigm in terms of finance and impact finance? So we promote this in Italy and beyond to respond to environmental challenges. We do that with people and communities, as well as research centers and public institutions, to support the development of an impact market, so that via research we can also produce evidence about what works fine and what can be done in the financial industry to work towards those goals. So positive impacts and investment. So impact investing, what is that at all? So finance can support innovative ways of being a journalist, like, for instance, impact journalism. See, this is the type of finance, the type of investment. Therefore, it should generate returns, at least in terms of return of capital, but it is also a at creating social and environmental impacts. It's a type of investing that should underline the degree of change that will be triggered by such investments. To understand what we define as the additionality of a project, it is absolutely necessary to be able to assess the produced change thanks to methods that should be as transparent as possible. So the political landscape for this context is the one created by the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, 17 goals that the international community is striving for by 2030. Unfortunately, the Secretary General of the UN stated in this report that we are lagging back, but still, out of those 17 goals with 169 indicators, there are a few which are particularly relevant for today's meeting. So freedom of expression and access to information, those are two pillars of the political agenda of the UN by 2030. So you see a few indicators here. It's just the tip of the iceberg, if you will, vis-a-vis what empowering conditions might be, or any possible limitations for and to free journalism and free information. So cases of killing, kidnapping, arbitrary detention, torture of journalists that unfortunately keep on happening throughout the world. But on top of that, there are quite a few other factors to be taken into account. But it's interesting to see that the sustainability strategy of the UN, when considering the goal of peace and justice, also include access to information and freedom of expression as to fundamental aspects. It's also relevant and interesting to understand that this is not merely a list of 17 items with some indicators, but rather they are goals which are intertwined with one another. Therefore, freedom of expression is connected to access to education, psychological and physical wellness and well-being, access to resources, gender equality, and so on and so forth. But it's quite evident that freedom of expression and access to information shape the way we go about our lives, as well as the way we can enjoy our fundamental rights. Obviously, this is connected to complex context. It helps holding private businesses and also public institutions accountable vis-a-vis what they do. So this is a relevant item underlying the role that journalism can play to promote this political agenda at an international level. So the next speakers will dive deeper into those topics that I just shall briefly mention here, portraying this link with how we can generate social value. For instance, giving a voice to the issues and perspectives of marginalized groups, and information and awareness in the decisional process, mobilize the public opinion for positive collective action. So participation in general, promoting the sense of community, upholding the rights of freedom and expression and opinion, accountability. And these are just a few examples of the many that we could quote to underline the relevance of impact journalism and create a more sustainable society. But we also know that this is deeply connected to difficulties. So here you see a few data taken from the Census Report 2023, underlining the perception of trustworthiness displayed by Italian citizens. Probably we could also draw a comparison with the other countries. And as you can see, there are a few factors in that might impact information, for instance, its relationship with the politics or the cost of quality journalism, the role of more experienced colleagues in interpreting the news or propaganda, and its oppressive role. I'm going to circulate this presentation after the meeting, so it's just to give you a little bit of a framework. Yeah. Then assessing impact and trying to understand how all this can be integrated into impact journalism, I'd like to start from a definition. So material not really to be understood as a word connected to something physical, but rather something which is typically listed in accounting books. So material is something that if omitted, misstated, or obscured, could reasonably be expected to influence the decisions of the primary users of some data, for instance, to run a business. Well, this concept of, let's say, accountability material can be also used at a social level. So, for example, that could be something that can be utilized to help stakeholders draw reasonable conclusions about the impact that they might generate and make better decisions. So an evidence-based approach. So what does that mean for a more concrete viewpoint? Businesses in their decision-making processes might pick a different management scenario to generate positive values, or rather destroying value. And the same goes for the press when they circulate pieces of news that might trigger a positive or a negative effect. So being aware of the consequences and also being aware of what is material from this viewpoint. So what is relevant, what is actually factual. So this should help us in our decision-making processes to spur social change. A few definitions of social impact. So here you have a definition stated by the OECD. So impact is the interplay of long-term effects, be that positive or negative, primary and secondary, anticipated or unanticipated, produced directly or indirectly by a development intervention. So we tend to represent what we do in positive terms, but we're missing out on a lot of pieces of material information that might influence the decisions made by our stakeholders. Therefore, they should be measured from a positive viewpoint as well as from a negative viewpoint, as we said, primary, secondary, anticipated or unanticipated, because the news might generate an effect that is unforeseen. That's why the news should be checked from a qualitative point of view as well. A further definition that I will only site here was published by a working group of the European Commission about impact economy. That underlines the relationship between a cause and a consequence, and as you can see, takes into account the negative consequences of any possible activity. So, social impact, we can move on and connect it to the idea of social value. So, there is a difference between the two. The term social impact is closely related to social value creation. So social value describes the broader benefits perceived by communities, the economy, and the environment, far beyond market prices. So that's something more. So we can express that via monetary indexes or with a matrix, but that's not all. So social value is the way we quantify the relative importance people attach to changes in the well-being they experience. At a physical level, that can be perceived in a different way by somebody who's younger versus somebody who's older, if you're free or if you are an inmate. Therefore, it is absolutely relevant to try and understand the stakeholders' relevant preferences, which might be contextual and contingent on specific circumstances and changing needs of local communities. So, this is a representation of the principles of social value. One of the main elements is the involvement of stakeholders to understand change, to enhance the value of whatever counts, to include that idea of material relevance without overestimating, by being transparent, by performing fact-checking activities, whilst being responsive. So deciding based on what we measured. So there is nothing worse than gathering pieces of information without using them. That has an impact.
Quanto riguarda magari investitori o aziende,
so that goes for businesses as well. That's relevant for businesses as well. So analyzing what we do with a responsible and responsive approach in terms of how we use data and pieces of information.
L'impact management project.
Impact management project, that's another worldwide initiative, quite interesting to help us understand how we can assess impact. Here is a graphical representation thereof to further reinforce what I've just stated. So how we can measure changes for people, positive changes, but also negative ones, to measure how deep those changes are with a quantitative approach, taking into account their effects in the short and long run, to understand who is changes, who is being impacted on by our actions, analyzing the contribution created by our actions within this change, as well as the risks that we take on in our activities. So this is another graph of the idea of the theory of change, as Professor Piacenza said in the beginning. That is a method that is now used in a number of industries, starting off from research, but also in philanthropy, in finance, in the business world, to try and chart the resources necessary to perform a certain activity, how that can be made concrete in terms of measurable items or products or organized events, to understand what the outcomes are. So the changes that are therefore produced to strive for a social goal. Impact, in this case, can be defined as a part of the long-term effects, be they positive and negative, which is attributable to the intervention net of external factors. So you can see here how I tried and further underline the importance of involving our stakeholders. All too often, they are left to the side, but we can't perform assessments like this one, sticking to our offices, sticking to the privileged positions that we have without interacting with the different groups that might be impacted on by our activities. So when we try and understand what impact we generate, as we said, we should try and involve journalists, citizens, institutions, public and private entities to understand what we are doing and how deep those changes are, how long will they run, and how important can that be, and how to which extent that can they be attributed to our actions. All those changes that can be more or less tangible. Of course, the manufacturing of products or psychological services or trainings can be easily measured and calculated, but there are further changes such as activism, activities created by the civil society or at a more psychological level. That's difficult to measure, but it's still feasible with the indicators to help us understand if there is a change which is ongoing and to which extent this is true. In literature, you will find a number of references in terms of indicators, features, and characteristics. I will share with you my presentation, as I said, and we will also have a few minutes for our Q&A sessions, should you wish to dive deeper into some of those indicators. But since we have to stick to the allocated time, I shall now move on and show you a few examples. I know that the next speakers, the upcoming speakers, will deal with this as well. But considering this journalistic perspective, I tried and put together some dimensions in which our journalistic activities can create change. So reach, how many people do we manage to reach? Or awareness within the different institutions and organizations when a topic is introduced to strengthen. Or we can also assess engagement, the engagement produced. So this is quite popular as an analysis, reach, awareness, and engagement, still helping us though to understand this interplay, this interaction with the media, considering the different targets and stakeholders involved. But we can also create changes onto attitudes, onto behaviors, influence of the influence of people who are particularly relevant along the decision-making process, so that we can also change different policies in place. So this is just in general a list of what we can think about when we conceive ourselves as a part of a system sparing change in the mid to the long run. So for every category, we can use assessment tools, sentiment analysis, network analysis, comments, interviews, all the way to ethnographic research. I shall move on quickly because I know I'm reaching the end of my time. So this is the framework from the viewpoint of some indicators. Unfortunately, I don't have the time to describe them all, but it's still interesting to see how OECD developed a way to measure well-being, including income and wealth, but also healthcare, social connections, work-life balance, safety, and so on and so forth. Another source of indicators is HIPSO, more for the business world, if you will, so for the private sector. So they developed a set of indicators to do this by industry, or IRIS Plus. That's an initiative mainly meant for investors interested in impact investing, so to understand the positive and negative impacts of the businesses they invest in. So this is something for you, some food for thought. And I'll now finish and conclude with a caveat. Let's try and understand first what we would like to measure. So we try and come up with some shortcuts, like lists to be applied without having analyzed this material relevance and significance of our pieces of information. What's the risk? Measuring non-material stakeholder information, non-relevant not even for us, for our businesses. Neglecting the context in which change occurs, so pay attention when comparing absolute data, since we might work in cultural, geographical contexts which differ from one another, not understanding how change happens, so the processes, and losing the sense of stakeholders' experiences of change, so missing out on the meaning thereof, better said, and then reinforcing majority biases, reinforcing this majority bias and hiding the needs of marginalized groups. So if we only analyze those indicators, we might expose ourselves to those risks. And I shall really conclude now by underlining how a good assessment also includes governance, impact management. Only by doing that in a transparent way within our different organizations will we be able to assess those situations and therefore decide correctly. So we have the SDGs impact standard developed by the UNDP to create a unified approach to manage this type of impact. I hope I made myself understood and that I managed to stick to the allocated time, and I am here should you have any questions. Thank you.
Grazie Filippo Montesi. Io direi non sono arrivate immediatamente domande di chiarimento.
Thank you so much, Mr. Filippo Montesi. We do not have any particular question right now. So let's say maybe if somebody maybe wants to deep dive some topics at the end of this webinar. I'd like to thank Mr. Filippo Montesi because he gave us a series of key concepts. They were not traditional ones in terms of a journalism approach. They were particularly interesting, especially in terms of the historical journalism, the so-called industrial journalism. Let's take a further step forward with Madam Lindsay Green-Barber, that I'd like to thank. She is the founder and director of Impact Architects. This is an organization that promotes a social impact through the combination of strategies and human research and social studies. She works particularly on journalism, on media, arts, culture, and higher education. She is going to introduce us to the topic of tools in order to measure the impact of journalists association. We'd like to know what Impact Architects does from this point of view, and wanted to know and understand what she really does. Thank you so much, Lindsay.
Grazie, buongiorno. Thank you so much for inviting me to be here with you all today. I'm excited to share this. I'll just say I'm in the United States in Colorado, so it's earlier in the morning for me. So if I'm a bit slow this morning, I'll ask your forgiveness. And much of what I'm going to share today really follows in line nicely with the work Filippo just shared. So I'm excited to see kind of the overlap there. But to start, I have a company called Impact Architects, and we do strategy and research with media companies and with philanthropic foundations that support journalism and media. We're based in the US, but we work here and internationally. We have kind of three main areas of work. First, we work directly with newsrooms. We'll be kind of focusing on that work today, where we help newsrooms to figure out their own definitions of impact that are in line with their missions and their goals, to create custom impact frameworks, which includes I loved Filippo's slide before. It had like outcomes and then the metrics. Like that's creating your own custom framework where you're thinking about what are the goals and outcomes that you might have, and then how much you measure that. And then moving into how to create customized ways to measure that work, including through something we call impact tracking, and I'll share more about that in a minute. We also do field building research. So we have, for example, a framework called the Healthy Local News and Information Ecosystem Framework that was developed in the US as a way to better understand an information ecosystem within one geography or one place. And that's a freely available tool that others can adapt. We also do things called inclusive content analyses. So working with organizations to better understand how something like coverage of an issue shifts over time. And then finally, our work directly with philanthropy and foundations. It's often to support grant making, especially for foundations that are newer into the journalism space, which I'll say is the case for many funders across Europe, actually, that are entering the journalism space. And there are new resources coming online for journalists and journalism organizations there. But for many funders who are thinking about things like climate change, they've recognized there's a value and a need for having more quality information from a journalistic perspective about those issues. And they're not always quite sure how to partner with journalism organizations or how to ask questions about impact, because we get into what can be a tricky situation around, what is journalistic integrity and what does that look like versus what is advocacy. So I'm happy to talk about that. We also do like portfolio reviews or evaluations for foundations once the funding is already underway. But again, today we're really going to talk about impact from the perspective of newsrooms. So defining it, how to build a culture of impact, and ultimately how you can measure that work. And just to be really clear up front, when I say measure, I'm talking both about quantitative and qualitative approaches to measurement. So in terms of defining impact, we take a very broad approach. We define impact as any change in the status quo that results from a direct intervention, whether that's a text article, documentary film, a live event, a podcast, regardless of the form the content is taking. We define impact in 4 categories. I should say we didn't kind of make up these categories. These come from, over a decade of working with hundreds of newsrooms across the globe. And in basically all cases, we see that impact kind of falls into these 4 categories. Institutional change is something that you hear particularly investigative reporters talking a lot about. The idea that when you put out a story that there's some sort of immediate institutional response, like a policy change, or someone gets like fired from a position, or like there are changes happening at the level of institutions. Jumping down, we also see individual change being something that newsrooms and organizations are kind of conditioned to be thinking about. So all of our advertising metrics are really geared at telling us about things that are happening at the level of the individual reader. And so in journalism, we often then equate things like unique page views or engagement metrics in social media with some sort of impact at the level of individuals in our audience. And that can be really helpful. And we can sometimes almost be limited by the availability of those metrics. And as we saw on the previous slide, if we're interested in something like people's perceptions about an issue changing, or if they're actually going to take action after being exposed to the content, then it may require an additional kind of measurement or tracking to know, really, did that longer term change happen? Network change is something that we hear a lot about, especially from journalists and organizations that are serving a particular community, whether it's geographic community or maybe a community of interest. But just this idea that if you're putting out quality information and content, that it actually can kind of help to provide connections or to connect different sectors of a community, and they can then kind of work together and maybe build power, engage in political processes or in other things in a different way. But again, it's when we see it, we can kind of know it when you see it type of impact, but it can be really hard to actually measure or to know how to talk about with stakeholders. And then finally, media amplification, particularly for organizations that are putting out content that either like a large data set that they hope other newsrooms will make use of, or in a case where you're putting out content and you might say, other newsrooms are free to republish these stories. Being able to really understand how that data or the content is spreading and kind of setting a public agenda can be challenging, but is often part of an organization's goal. This framework here, this illustration, is meant to just really show that these 4 different categories of impact in our mind are all closely interrelated, and that change doesn't happen in just one direction. So I think I'll go back to the example of investigative reporting. The premium is often put on reporting that has that institutional change. If we even just think about the structure of like journalism awards, it tends to really reward those projects that have big splashy institutional change right out of the gate. The challenge there from our perspective is that that's great. And if we can only see stories that have that kind of impact as successful, it means we're going to ignore like lots of other really important reporting that can happen out there. And so by broadening the aperture a bit and seeing how actually if we're reaching individuals or if our content is helping to networks grow and strengthen, that can actually lead to institutional change over the long term. And what is the role of journalism in some of those broader social change processes, as opposed to just like what happens immediately in the wake of reporting. The challenge, of course, is that for many organizations, this work is kind of new. And so you might have a person or people who are really interested in impact. You might be, a freelancer who's really interested in it, and you're working with organizations that maybe don't have language and haven't prioritized it. And so a lot of this work becomes not only like how do we measure it, but actually how do we build internal cultures that value impact, that understand journalistic impact is in fact part of the mission. Longer term, that can help make the connections between sustainability and revenue streams and actual impact of work is something that we're seeing lots of organizations kind of experimenting with here in the US now. But we see there being kind of 3 critical components to how to build this culture of impact. And first, you need an organizational commitment and prioritization. So you need not only someone to think it's interesting, but for an organization to really say, this is going to become core to the way that we are doing our work. We are going to bring impact into conversations about editorial story selection, audience engagement, revenue generation, and it's going to become something that is just expected as part of our staff's kind of work across the organization. Then you need workflows, both for planning for impact as well as for measurement for impact. So we'll talk about tools. I know lots of folks today are going to talk about different tools, and ultimately there is still a workflow thing here. there isn't like a magic impact machine that just tells you what your impact score is, unfortunately, at least not yet. So it does require humans in the mix here. Which gets to the last point, which is knowing when technology can help both to plan and measure impact, and when technology maybe can't. And sometimes we come into these conversations like looking for the technological solution, when really what we need is to go 3 steps back and say, okay, what are the goals of our organization? How do we define impact? What are the outcomes desired? And then kind of work into metrics and tools and all of that stuff. But if I were going to make kind of the pitch for why bother, then if this is going to require some work on behalf of you and or your organizations. First, there's a really clear component just of reputation building, understanding what your impact is, and then being able to communicate it with your audiences, with your staff, even with your peers. Really does help to demonstrate your value to all of those stakeholders. And so you can think about how you can use that information to build trust with audiences. And then there's editorial strategy. So again, hopefully this work isn't divorced from the editorial work, but instead is really integrated into those workflows. And so you can use that to help shed light on, what projects, what types of stories are having the most impact, where might there be opportunities to deepen that impact, and how can you deepen your storytelling around those opportunity areas. And then finally, there are opportunities for institutional support. So if you are interested in, what is the grant making landscape, what kind of philanthropic resources might be available for work. Again, we're seeing kind of more and more of that. Being able to communicate your impact is critical for that kind of support. So given kind of that context, the need that we saw, and I should say prior to founding Impact Architects, I worked at an organization called the Center for Investigative Reporting, which was a nonprofit news organization. And much of this work began when I was there. But the need we saw there, that I've seen again in hundreds of newsrooms at this point, is there really is a need to centralize data collection. So when we talk about impact, lots of reporters will say, oh yeah, I have a Google Doc or a Word doc or maybe a spreadsheet where you might be keeping track of all of your kind of impact or audience feedback or however you're thinking about it already, because you might need it for fellowship applications or for award applications, or like people already have this. And so the question becomes, how do you centralize data collection? How do you build a culture of impact across an organization? And then, how could we use technology to help systematize and organize some of this so that you can get really high quality, qualitative databases of impact to put together with all of those quantitative metrics that we have access to. And then we heard people wanted something that was more visual. So this project started as like how to organize all of your information essentially in a spreadsheet. And people are like, okay, great, but that doesn't really help us do a lot of sense making. So we wanted to create something that could have a nice visual overlay that can identify trends, give different ways to communicate impact with stakeholders. And so we created the Impact Architects Impact Tracker. It's not very creatively named, but it makes it clear, hopefully, what the platform helps an organization to do. I'll say the platform we've built is totally free. It's built in a Google suite of products. And I'll just, underscore that we've seen other organizations take the same approach, but build it into Airtable or into Salesforce or another kind of tool or technology platform that they're already using. And the goal here is to help news organizations be able to understand the impact of journalism by taking some definitions in that framework and then really generating these qualitative data sets over time. Because it's built in Google, it's a Google form to a spreadsheet, which hopefully no one really has to touch other than the people who might be kind of doing data curation and cleaning. Excuse me. Into a Google Looker Studio. And so the Google Looker Studio has lots of plugins. You can bring in your Google Analytics and kind of other data sources, and we've seen interesting things that people are doing there. But the template we have has some standard visualizations for the impact tracker specifically. And, some people ask, like, who's this for? How big does our organization need to be? We've seen folks successfully use this, individual freelancers, as a way just to be able to organize the information that they're wanting to about the impact of their work, to large organizations like the AP in the United States or National Public Radio System, to smaller like nonprofit newsrooms. So there are a diverse array of use cases that we've seen this approach kind of work for. The key is just kind of figuring out what the right workflow is for your organization. And so in terms of the process of kind of getting oneself set up, the most important part, again, first is this front end work, which is really defining what impact looks like for you or for your organization. Making sure you're developing indicators that map to the actual desired outcomes, and then building into this tool any of that qualitative offline impact that just doesn't live in your other indicators and doesn't live in your Google Analytics or your Instagram insights and things. And then you can actually embark on the process of tracking these impact over time and think about measuring it. I'll drop in the chat after a link to our website. There are resources for how to kind of engage in this process on your own and get yourself onboarded, how to documents and things. And there's a sign up for office hours if anyone is interested in this, but needs a little bit of help getting it kickstarted. So I mentioned it's a 3-part system. The intake form is where a reporter, an editor, kind of whomever in the organization, when you observe some sort of offline impact or real world change, you would just fill out this form. It's designed to take like 30 seconds or less once folks have used it a couple of times. And then we didn't add in a picture here of the spreadsheet, because again, the goal is that no one needs to go to the spreadsheet. And then when you want to actually see the impact, you can go to the Google Looker Studio dashboard and be able to see that. This visual here just demonstrates some of the other inputs that you can hook up to the Looker Studio so that you can have kind of a one-stop shop for all things impact. And I just want to point out that the last box here is human learnings and insights, because even with this platform, even with these visualizations, the last step still is having a person to look at the data and look at the information and say, oh, this is interesting. Like our climate coverage last month had lots of network impact. What was going on there? Why was that? Was it a partnership we had? Was it organic pickup of the content? Or, it gives you better questions to ask as opposed to answering all the questions you might have about impact. Again, this deck will be shared with everyone afterwards, but there are links to resources here, as well as the place where you can sign up again for office hours, or if you get going and need some troubleshooting help, you can always reach out to us and let us know. There's a sign up for a newsletter that's relatively infrequent, but we do have, I think there are over 100 newsrooms that we know of that are using the impact tracker across the globe right now. And we do periodically ask people that are doing interesting things with the work to write a blog post or put together some content that we can share with the network, because we know it's all of you all that have great ideas and are doing really interesting things with the work, and we want to make sure that that's shared out. So if it's something you want to follow along with, you can feel free to sign up for our newsletter there. And that's it. I'm happy to answer any questions. I know we're maybe at time for this section, but again, thank you for inviting me to share with you all today.
Grazie Lindsay. Una domanda io ce l'avrei.
Thank you so much, Lindsay. I have a question for you. This is a question concerning the size of organizations. The organization that can use a tool just like Impact Tracker. Is it possible that this tool is useful also for a small organization or even for freelancers?
Yeah, absolutely. We've seen organizations of all different sizes use this, including freelancers. And so, in some ways for freelancers who are needing to put together applications pretty frequently for like fellowships or for other things, this can be a really helpful way to be able to just keep track of all that information. You can like sort and filter. So let's say you want to put together a fellowship for, or an application for like a climate reporting fellowship, you could go in and sort all of your impact associated with your climate reporting, for example, and get a quick download of that to be able to put into the application. So absolutely. I think what maybe differs with different organizational sizes is just the workflow processes and what does onboarding kind of look like. So if you're a freelancer or a really small organization, it tends to be more straightforward to define what does impact mean for you. What does that framework look like? What are your outcomes? What are the indicators? And then implementation also tends to just be easier. And that's, I think, a principle of organizational management. When you get into a larger organization, it can be more challenging because there are more people, more ideas about it, what impact looks like. And so there we always say, you know, starting with a process that includes representation across departments and leadership levels is really important. And then for rollout, we recommend piloting it with a smaller team. So it might be one like coverage area team that's reporting it, or maybe one platform team or something. So it becomes more about the process than the actual like approach or the tool itself.
Ancora una
One more
domanda,
question for you, Lindsay. As for Impact Tracker, that is coexistent with some other measurement tools. We have a common traditional measurement tools, just like the data analytics, for example, the ones concerning SEO or you know, for example, then pages and so on. But actually, we have also some other measurement and evaluation models. So before, maybe then referring to a kind of interpretation according to the user's needs. How can these platforms can be intertwined, just like, for example, with Impact Tracker? Thank you.
That's a really good question. And just to make sure I'm clear, because we really recommend that folks start with what's our framework, what are the outcomes we desire, and then what are the indicators and measurement approaches. We would only say, oh yes, use the impact tracker. If you get through all of that and you have a bunch of kinds of impact you're looking for that are happening offline that aren't captured in your analytics, or that you don't have a way to be able to measure. So this is not in place of, but we hope in addition to. And we hope that process helps people work through, because you go into your Google Analytics and there are like literally thousands of metrics you can track there. It can be really overwhelming. And so by going through this process of, you know, what are our goals? What are the indicators that best help us know that? We hope that helps you pare down to, you know, here are actually like the 5 analytics that are most important to us that actually tell us if we're achieving our goal. And then thinking about how do you integrate that with this offline impact tracking? How might you do things like social listening or broader kind of content analysis or sentiment analysis to see how topics are being covered? And so some of that is, you know, technical. What could be displayed in, you know, one dashboard? Could you hook up your Google Analytics and find a way to link it to some of these so you can get better visualizations about different topic areas of coverage? And then some of it is saying, well, we're going to do quarterly, you know, internal impact memos, and we're going to do an annual external facing impact report. And it gives you kind of deadlines to bring all of those pieces together. And again, that human insights and learning layer, to bring that into it, layer it on top, do sense making with all those different data sources. And then again, hopefully say not only, well, okay, great, what can we communicate externally, but what does this tell us about what's been working this last quarter with our editorial processes? What does it tell us about what stories we maybe should be covering going forward? And so again, hoping this is integrated into broader organizational processes and not just like, oh, it's over on the side and it's about you know, fundraising or advertising or something.
Thank you.
Grazie. Allora,
Thank you, Lindsay.
Facciamo un altro passo avanti, poi
So
torniamo
one more
ancora
step
grazie a
forward,
Lindsay
then we're coming
Greenbarber.
back to
Torneremo
you,
probabilmente da
maybe at
lei
the
alla
end.
fine.
We're coming back probably
Facciamo
to
un passo
Lindsay
anteriore
Greenbarber. So if
con
there are any
Richard
questions,
Eddy. Richard Eddy è
question at the
cofondatore
end.
di
Then we have
Acres,
now here
società di
Mr.
consulenza
Richard
internazionali in
Eddy.
materia di audience strategy, che si
He
rivolge
belongs
a
to
media,
ACAS
istituzioni internazionali, fondazioni,
and then
NGO.
they deal with the
La sua missione è
NGOs. They
aiutare
deal with many
l'organizzazione ad
different
aumentare il proprio
situations. So their mission
impatto
is to
attraverso la
improve the impact
comprensione del loro
in
pubblico
order
di
to understand
riferimento.
their
Gli
audience,
stakeholder, che
understand
come
their
abbiamo sentito anche da quello che
stakeholders,
diceva Filippo
and
Montesi, sono figure
as
cruciali, quindi dobbiamo
we heard with
recuperare
Filippo
anche il senso di cui
Montesi,
non siamo
so we know
abituati
that the stakeholders
a
are, of
tenere
course,
conto come giornalisti,
crucial
o abbastanza abituati a tenere
then
conto come
elements.
giornalisti, e degli
Sometimes we do
ecosistemi
not maybe then consider
con
them. We
cui
have to
gli
consider all the
stakeholders
different
e
ecosystems where
le
the
organizzazioni stesse
stakeholders
si
and
relazionano.
organizations are
Con lui
acting.
ci concentriamo
With
sulle tecniche di
Richard, we're going to
misurazione
focus
dell'impatto
on
sociale del giornalismo, a partire dalla
on measuring social
presentazione di uno
impact in
strumento
journalism.
che
We start with
Hackers
a tool
ha
which
messo a
is
disposizione, che si chiama
ACAS
Impact
was
Wheel.
made available, which
Grazie
is
Richard.
Impact Wheel. Thank you, Richard.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to this talk. Thank you, Filippo and Lindsay, for your prior insights. Much of what I'm going to say will repeat and build on what's already said, so hopefully some of the messages will lock through. I'm just going to talk about going over a period of time, starting 20 years ago with my own insights on impact when I worked at the BBC. Then the last 12 years or so working with ACAS, and then talk about your own impact journey, building on what's been said already. So about 20 years ago, my impact journey started when the BBC lost its Director General, its CEO, and its chair within 20 hours. So it was a crisis in the organization. And I became the chief of staff to the guy that became the acting CEO or Director General. And later on in that year, in 2024, as part of its needing to respond to the crisis, but also as part of its strategic review, the BBC published an important document called Building Public Value. And in that document was the first time I explicitly saw impact being put at the heart of an organization, including its journalism. And the framework that the BBC used then was reach, quality, impact, and value. I became the chief advisor to the guy that ran all the BBC's journalism. And as part of that, there were the kind of goals or aims of the journalism, similar to what Lindsay was just talking about, the need to be clear about what you're trying to do. They were around citizenship, sustaining citizenship and civil society, around the nations and communities, making sure that they were clearly represented in the journalism, and internationally about bringing the UK journalism to the world and the world to the UK. And there was this framework, again, clarifying what the BBC News was trying to do at a local, national, international level, which was about the formats that the team was using, the groups and the regions that we're trying to connect to, and the platforms that the audiences needed to be were on and we needed to respond to. And we worked very closely with the audiences team back then to understand what were the stories that were being very closely followed by audiences. And there were regular surveys every week just to understand what the top stories were, both domestically and internationally. And at that time, we learned that the economy was extremely important, things around weather and weather events were important, but international stories were also important too. So this gave us a kind of a gauge of those stories that connected with audiences. And off the back of that, an important impact activity was called the Big Stories. And this is where journalists and specialists came together to discuss the coverage of the big themes before they happened. And here are some examples from that time. Aligned to that, we tracked from surveys what audiences thought the BBC was best for. How good was its coverage in the broader sense around a whole range of stories? And I think most importantly, in terms of the impact journey back then, audiences were asked whether the coverage of the BBC of those stories, be it the economy, be it COP climate summits, be it crises in the Middle East, was their understanding improved? And over time, the BBC was was able to see what the historic average was, which was a 69% of audiences feeling that their understanding improved, and whether for any particular story, the BBC was doing better or doing worse than that average. So that was then, that was over kind of 10 to 20 years ago. And if one thing to recognize here is most of the so-called impact measurement or performance measurement was very heavily survey based at the time. And that was predominantly because quite a lot of the more digitally based, online based metrics hadn't developed so much. So I left the BBC in 2011 and then started up ACAS in 2012. With ACAS, we work with international institutions, news and media, foundations, charities, strategy and research organizations, and we also support original journalism. The co-founder, my partner, Luba Kosova, she does original journalism, and we support that with the work ACAS does. And these, you'll have this presentation yourself, so you'll be able to look through this list. And unfortunately, over the last few years, a lot of them reports that use our impacts approach in an underlying way have received wide recognition and awards, and you'll be able to look at that again in your own time. In terms of developing our impacts framework, we were inspired by a range of great organizations and publications. My time at the BBC, since for the last 12 years, we've worked very closely with The Guardian in developing its impact approach. The Gates Foundation is a key client where we've helped them develop their impacts framework. And we're inspired by the work of the Centre for Investigative Reporting. Actually, it was Lindsay Green Barber who, when she was there at the time, did some great work that she's talked about a few moments ago, but was really helped us clarify our thinking around impacts. And also some excellent books that really gave another dimension into thinking about impact. So that's Narrative Economics by a guy called Robert Scheller and James T. Hamilton, Democracy Detectives. If you want to read that and you're an economist like I am from a background, you might find that interesting. So all of those things and a number of other sources were really helpful in helping us clarify our impacts journey. And over the years, working with organizations, we recognize there's a whole range of activities that we're trying to track in some way or another. And we're using, and these are kind of just a few of them, but there are many more. And we recognize that there's a different types of tools. There are either quantitative tools or qualitative tools, tools that help you understand what is going on, and tools that help you understand why it is happening. And typically, a lot of the impact tracking that we've seen historically tends to focus on web analytics and social media analytics. And they are helpful in their own right. But as Lindsay said, and others will say, there's so much more we can use to get a much more rounded picture of the impacts that you're trying to have. The qualitative dimension is really important from a qualitative tracker like Lindsay talked about, or attitudinal surveys that we talked about in the BBC, and bringing them all together can give you a better sense of impact rather than just relying on page views and likes, etc. And one of the important measures we use is a concept of linking. And linking is all about who's hyperlinking to who. So here's an example. For example, in June of this year, the Solutions Journalism Network hyperlinked into the Torino Social Impact. And this is the hyperlink. So at the corner of the slide in red, you'll see that there's a thing that says learn more and register. If you clicked onto that, you went to the Torino Social Impact website. Those links give us a kind of powerful impact metric if we develop them further. So what we did is to develop an approach whereby for any URL address, an article, web page, or a news website, we can understand which stakeholder organizations are linking to that individual article or to the website. And we do this by downloading through a third-party site like Ahrefs, downloading all the links to that particular site, then comparing that to a number of databases, governmental databases, parliamentary databases, news media websites, universities, think tanks, all kind of social society organizations. And then we track to see what proportion of those leading websites is any individual website linking to. So for example, we downloaded the links to La Repubblica as an example. And what that shows us that when we download the links to La Repubblica, there were approximately 92,000 links to Repubblica. And of those 92,000, we found that just over 1,000 of them were linking to a portion of the world's top 6,000 or so news organizations. In Europe, 40% of the top websites have linked into La Repubblica. In Italy itself, nearly 80% of the top websites have linked into La Repubblica. So linking as a tool can give you a sense of how well you're connected to other organizations and how well organizations are seeing you or understanding you. Now, I should note that that's our tool, but you can create your own lists of target organizations. You can ask yourself, in an ideal world, and when we look at the portfolio of all our journalism, and if you've got a particular project or particular series of articles, if you ask yourself, what are the 100 organizations we'd really like to link to us in some way, you can create that list, download the links to all of your website and see whether any of those target organizations are in that list. In fact, you don't need to use a tool like Ahrefs. You can manually go and search your particular URLs and see what comes up. That takes a lot longer, but it is possible to do manually. And then for in your own time, these are some of the analyses you can do when you're thinking about looking at your impact. So obviously there's the big impact analysis we're going to talk about in a minute, but you can do content analysis, which looks at the trends and narratives for keywords in any content. You can do coverage analysis, which understanding the issues and keywords that are covered by media in your country or across the globe, or going down, I've talked about LinkedIn analysis. So there's many there for you to look at and review. So in terms of our impact framework, we use all of these particular insights to create an impact wheel. It's always changing because this whole space is changing all the time. We're always changing it. We realize we've got some things wrong and we realize we're not covering particular aspects, but this is what it currently looks like. And it starts off by thinking about the content. When we're doing a report, we look at the context. What's happening around the world in terms of trends? What are the audience's habits? Then we look at the strategy and resources of the news organization, the number of people involved, the budget they're assigning to a particular initiative, the culture in that organization. And culture is something that is incredibly important. It's been raised already, but if you don't have a culture of impact, it's quite hard to make it part of the DNA of an organization. And number 3, we look at content and outputs. How many stories, what type of stories, what platforms are you on, what kind of events are you pushing? And then we go into short-term outcomes, which are reach and engagement related. And those are typically your social media and your web analytics that we all know and love. And then we come into 3 areas closely related to the areas that Lindsay talked about, slightly different framing: public impacts, influencer impacts, and decision maker impacts. And in public impacts, we're looking at evidence for the change in knowledge, attitudes, awareness, self-efficacy, the feeling that audiences or individuals can do something off the back of your journalism, or any collective action that's been taken, whether it's raising funds or deciding to go on a march or deciding to write to your local representative. And then in that, we also have case studies, and the case studies are where you're qualitatively collecting the impacts with audiences, be it an important insight where a member of your audience has written to you and said, as a result of your article, I did this or I did that. Then we look at influencer impacts, and this is where we're looking at the amplification of the content through media. And I gave you the example of La Repubblica there to show how their journalism is being linked to by other news organizations. But you can also see whether it's being cited by other news organizations, and not just news organizations, but other stakeholder and civil society groups, our universities or think tanks or governmental departments linking or talking about the content. In this influencer bit, we also have some recognition you might get from awards or statements about your reputation from key influencers. And is there any evidence that they're connecting with the content? And then finally around there, are you being invited to talk about a particular issue or invited to conference and events? And then on decision-making impacts, whether you've, as a result of the journalism, not just your journalism, but as a result of a collection of articles or initiatives around the space, you can argue you were part of changing the debate, or an individual decision maker had to be made more accountable. They had to be forced to resign or issue a statement. Or did policy change, or was money moved around as a result of your campaign? Or do you have evidence that decision maker organizations or individuals have connected to your content, liked it, have commented it, have linked to it? And then finally, impact learnings. This is around what have you learned from this whole process? And as Lindsay mentioned earlier, you might do this on a quarterly basis or a 6-monthly basis or an annual basis. We report for The Guardian on a number of their different initiatives every 6 months. That's kind of a helpful measure to see when impacts are lighting or changing. And so you look at the successes, challenges, opportunities, and how you might shift your goals so that the next time round in your impacts journey, you're really thinking about what's worked and what hasn't worked so much. And on the side there, I've thrown out some of the tools that we've seen and we use and we love, to the point that there is never going to be one measure that's going to help you tell your impact. It's a collection of different measures, and we try to beg, borrow, and steal and develop anything that helps us see changes as a result of your journalism. So when you're finally, when you're thinking about your own impact, we've got this kind of term called teams, which is assessing the impact advantages you currently have, and then deciding whether you need to pause on measuring your impact because maybe your organization isn't ready. Decide to learn or train yourself, experiment, do some research, hire people in, buy tools, convince your bosses because there's a culture change. So going through each of these very quickly, if you've got time on your hands, unfortunately, most practitioners in journalism don't, but if you do have time in your hands, that gives you the opportunity to research and learn, to experiment yourself, to manually start tracking stories, either using Google search to put in your URL or the title of your articles and see what comes up. That does involve you trawling through a lot of information, but it can be incredible. And I used to do that before using lots of tools, and it's amazing what you can pick up. Obviously, you can align this with things like free tools like Google Alerts, which will pipe up when you've put in the right term to look for. But tools in general allow you to automate activities, but it's really important that you understand what's being automated before throwing yourself at a tool. Expertise provides you with a deep understanding of each impact approaches. You can access resources via the web, like this webinar. There'll be other webinars. You can hire in consultancies. like myself or like Impact Architect and others, or you can become an expert yourself by spending the time to really learn about what's going on. Attitude is about embracing the impacts culture. It's such a critical one, and you have to understand whether your organization is ready on the impacts journey. Hopefully, given the challenges journalism has in general, most organizations are beginning to realize the importance of impact. So having the right attitude is important. Do you have money? If you do have money, it enables you to buy tools. You could create a dedicated impact role or work directly with expert consultancies. And the data and insights is not enough. You need to spend some time on how you communicate your impact story so that you manage to translate the difference you're making to your stakeholders and inside your own organization. And good luck, and thank you very much.
Grazie, grazie Richard. Io ho raccolto due domande
Thank
che
you
ti
very much,
sottopongo
Richard. I
dai
have two
nostri
questions for you.
partecipanti al
Two
panel.
questions asked
La
by
prima
the
è,
participants to this panel.
lavorando nelle
So first
relazioni
of
per
all,
introdurre
working
questa metrica,
to introduce this metric,
hai incontrato degli ostacoli,
have you
delle
ever
resistenze
had
da parte
to
di chi?
face some
Redazioni,
resistance or any
direzioni,
resistance, and
aziende
displayed
oppure
by
dagli
whom?
stessi singoli
Businesses,
giornalisti?
colleagues, so fellow
Questa è la prima
journalists,
domanda. La
institutions.
seconda
So that
domanda
would be the first
invece
question. The
è
second one
relativa
would be
all'engagement e
about
la crescita dell'audience.
engagement and audience growth.
Quanto si può aumentare
So
il proprio
how
pubblico
much can you
utilizzando
grow your audience,
e quando si possono coprire anche
and
nuove
when
audience
can you attract
utilizzando una
new
metrica di
types of
impatto come quelle
audiences
che ci hai
via a
indicato.
metric,
Hai dati
a
forniti
metric
dalle
type of metrics
esperienze
like the one that
che
you
avete
stated and
fatto
talked
che
about. So
indicano
do you have
una
any data
crescita anche o
indicating
un
any growth
arricchimento delle
or how
audience?
you manage to
Grazie.
enrich your audience based on the indicators and indexes that you told us about? Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you, Paolo, for those two questions. So on the first one around resistance, certainly when I first started in not just around impacts, but in audience measurement and audience research in general, there was an enormous amount of resistance, specifically because specifically in the newsroom, and journalists felt that journalism shouldn't be driven by audiences. It can be informed, but not driven. So there was a real resistance to that. Secondly, there was a concern, especially in news organizations in Europe and the US, that there's a thin line between impact measurement and advocacy. So those two elements led to a lot of resistance. And the way to overcome that, we found, and especially it's been much easier in recent years, is to recognize that many of the metrics that we've been tracking over time, especially in the last 10 years, are starting to go in the wrong direction. So page views, for example, interest in news is under extreme pressure since COVID. Our data is showing a real sharp fall in those dimensions over the last 2 or 3 years. And so an argument for the newsroom is that there are other measures of how well you're doing that you're not tapping into. Those measures arguably are giving a much richer sense of the success of your journalism. So why not try to understand them, be it organizations linking to you, be it policy change, be it comments about your journalism. And often we find that news organizations are under reflecting or underrepresenting the impact they have. So that's a very powerful way of starting to win over the journalistic communities. But usually it's kind of traditional journalists who feel this is a slightly dangerous path to go down. And then on the second point, what's the impact with growing audiences? A really powerful thing. So I spent a year working with The Guardian developing their membership proposition. And other organizations since then, and many others have developed membership propositions. And the key thing about membership, and not just membership, but subscriptions, is the need to develop relationships, direct relationships with your audiences. And when you start to develop direct relationship with your audiences, you need to start to unpack news and journalism and explain to them not only the processes you've gone through, but what's been the outcome. And what we found is audiences really recognize and they value being told what happened as a result of the journalism. So if you're tracking the impact of a story or series of stories, you play back to your audiences, this is the difference that your funding, your support and loyalty to us has made. That makes it much more likely that your audience is going to stay loyal to you and they can see the difference your journalism is making.
Grazie Richard.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Richard. Let's go on now, but stay tuned for further questions before the end of this webinar. Let's now leave the word to Vera Pineda, Director of Programs and Impact at the European Journalism Centre in Maastricht, in Holland, to further strengthen media and journalism in the Council of Europe. Over the years, Vera Pineda has designed and developed a significant number of training programs, grants, scholarships, and accelerators in journalism and innovation to support newsrooms and journalists across Europe to adapt to the new challenges and become more resilient. Vera will talk to us about some tools to assess impact journalism based on what is offered by the EJC. Thank you.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, and I want to thank Paolo for the introduction, and also Filippo, Lindsay, and Richard for their previous interventions and insights, of course. So I guess I would like to share my screen so we can start right away. How's that? It's good, right?
Perfect.
Yeah. Okay, perfect. So first I'd like to start by telling you a little bit about the European Journalism Centre, because I'm not sure everyone in the room knows about our existence and what we do. And hopefully we'll be able to support you as well if you are a journalist or working as part of a newsroom. So we are a non-profit or a social enterprise, and we are based in the city of Maastricht. We were created in the same year of the Treaty of Maastricht in 1992. That's why we're based here. And we exist to support, strengthen, and develop journalism and media organizations in the region of the Council of Europe, which is a little bit broader than the European Union. The Council includes 46 countries at the moment. And so in this sense, we are a center for knowledge and collaboration with the partners, funders that work in the media landscape. And we like to think that we believe that reimagining journalism is very important. And why do we talk about this? Because you cannot really achieve what you can't imagine, right? So we need to visualize what we want journalism to look like and its impact to be in society in order to work towards that goal. And you can see there in the images a couple of examples of things that we do and ways we support journalists. So we provide grants in different shapes and as part of our programs. We have, for example, a podcast about innovation, right? That is part of a community that everything is free to join. For the programs, of course, like the grants, you need to apply. Just today, we launched a new fellowship to support media leaders that are interested in producing climate coverage that is solutions-oriented. And so there is information about all these opportunities in our website. There's also a solutions journalism if you're thinking about adopting that mindset in your journalistic production. And so I would like to explain that our organization as a nonprofit is a little bit of a hybrid, right? Because we measure impact on two different dimensions. We need to measure the impact of our work in the media landscape. So this means all the trainings, all the grants that the EJC provides to journalists and newsrooms. What is the impact of these programs and these interventions? But we also want to evaluate the impact of the journalism that we support. So if a story was produced with the grant given by the EJC, then we need to work with the newsrooms and the freelance journalists to try and ascertain the impact of this journalistic work. So we let's say, we have these double dimensions of impact that we need to measure to justify the work we do and to evaluate if we should continue doing, we need to change the way we work, and so on and so forth. So we listen by working with newsrooms and freelancers to whom we provide a lot of mentoring as part of our programs and training. We listen from them. Why is it so challenging to measure impact? And I thought about sharing this with you because I understand many of you are working in newsrooms, many of you are doing freelance work, and perhaps this resonates with your own challenges. And so we hear from newsrooms and freelancers that the news cycle is really too fast. And so they are producing a story, they publish it, and then they don't have time to go and measure their impact, and let alone go back to that topic a year after the story or the investigation were published to see what was the impact of that story in a community, or even when we're talking just about evaluating quantitative and quantitative data, not qualitative, right? Many editors tell us, oh, we don't know where to start. We've heard about impacts, but how do we define impact, right? And Lindsay and Richard have already spoken about that, right? These are the type of interventions that that newsrooms and journalists do with their journalism, right? What type of interventions do you want to have? What type of social change do you want to generate with your work? And so editors don't really know how to do this exercise or where to start building an impact tracker. And for that, I would also recommend that you look at the work of impact architects as well. Then there is a mindset, right? So we've also talked about this, building a culture of impact is difficult because editors tell us, how do we convince the management about this? And if they have a team of journalists, how do you show and convince all your journalists that it is worth their time and their investment to measure impact, right? And with journalists, what we hear from them, we ask them, so what drove you to cover a certain story? And usually the starting point of the journalists, and I speak against myself, I was a journalist for many years, a field reporter, they tell us, oh, people need to know about this. We must cover this story, right? And it's of course, the intention is very good, but you have to take a little bit of a step back and, well, reflect on what nowadays is very much spoken about in our landscape, which is in our industry, which is user needs, right? To understand, does your audience also feel like that about the story? Is that a story that interests your community or your audience? Because we know that journalists at heart, they have good intentions. They want to make the world a better place, but good intentions are not enough to decide whether or not we should go about covering a certain topic. And then we also see that journalists and editors complain of, oh, we have not been trained on measuring impact, right? We have no resources. We didn't learn this at the university. When I went to the university, there was no conversations about impact, right? So it is still rather new to many newsrooms. I put there many because there are many others who are already on track and doing their own exercises and iterating with ways of measuring impact, right? We also hear a lot that many journalists think that impact is only measured after the story is published. And I'll talk a little bit about this because we have learned through experiences that you can plan for impact and you can do a lot just before you start working on a story or on a series of articles and investigation, right? And then at the end of the day, we all know that measuring the real world of impact is really challenging, right? Who can tell if one story or one investigation was really the reason why a law has been changed, or really why, you know, a revolution has happened? Usually it doesn't work like that. Usually we're talking about coverage that lasts through time, and we're talking about a big number of articles about the same topic done by many newsrooms across the world until a certain status quo in society changes, right? Until we see real change happening. So I would like to mention then, if it's so difficult to measure impact, what's in it for us journalists and newsrooms, right? Why should we be doing it? And these are some of the reasons why we want to invite you, right, to start measuring impact or improve the way you're doing this work. This will bring you the trust of your audience in a much needed time when we know that people are avoiding the news, actively avoiding the news, and we need to regain trust, or in certain cases, rebuild trust from scratch with communities that are not yet being reflected in the news. This will bring visibility to your news brand or to your work as well. Inside newsrooms and media outlets, there is staff recognition and a sense of achievement among your team members, right? When you measure impact and you understand, wow, our work, our investigation generated these actions at the court level, or these discussions at the community level. And there's much more in it, right? You can have new paying subscribers, new supporting members. You can find grants to support your work as well. It is a need these days to really track the impact of your work to justify your existence. That is the reality as a news outlet and as a journalist producing a certain number of stories. So I am going to bring you 5 tips, you know, to help you plan and measure for the social impact of your journalism, because I believe that, you know, Lindsay is the expert on creating an impact framework. And I should mention that at the European Journalism Center, we use the Impact Architects impact framework to measure the impact of our work. Richard is the expert on tools. So I believe, you know, this could be a useful contribution for everyone to get some ideas of what you can do at the level of your organizations or as a freelance journalist. So first, you need to define what's success for you, right? What is it, the end game of your work? What do you want to achieve? Right, and perhaps one way you can start by doing this is, for every story, you just have there a very simple prompt, right? You can do this as a newsroom or a journalist, and you can say, our reporting on a certain topic, right, on gender equality, for example, will create a certain impact, will improve the situation of working mothers, let's give as an example, right, for a specific audience. In this case, it could be women in their 40s, in their 30s, in their 40s. And then you also state, how will you measure this impact? So These two sentences can, help you start thinking at the beginning of each story or each series of articles on how you can plan for impact. And I would love to take credit for this way of doing things, but this you can find very clear in the Solutions Journalism Impact Tracking Guide, which is a great resource for you to take a look at. And then you can decide, what are you going to track? Are you going to track changes in public discourse, in policy developments, in shifts in your community behavior, right? You can do this by creating an Excel sheet, a very easy Excel sheet, or a Google form, to help you track these changes. It's better not to choose all of the changes for every story, right? So you don't become very overwhelmed. There are lists online, and Impact Architects also has a great list of items that you can measure to track the impact of your work. And then another suggestion is that you engage the target community early. And this is what I meant in the beginning, that most newsrooms and journalists go about measuring impact once the story gets published, right? But especially investigative newsrooms that have more tradition or are a bit more, already have more sophisticated systems to measure impact, they have realized that involving the community that is going to receive, that is the end audience or receiver of your journalistic work, involving them in the beginning is actually very fruitful, because by talking to people about a certain topic, and you can do this through surveys, through focus groups, or just by, researching on social media to understand how do they feel about a certain topic? If they see that this story is important to them, do they need this story to make better decisions in their daily life? Is this really going to make a difference to the people who you want to be reading your stories, right? And I gave an example there, the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, an investigative media outlet based in the UK, does a lot of this almost for all their stories. They also have a brilliant newsletter explaining how they go about impact. So that's another suggestion I would like to leave with you. Then, of course, and this has been mentioned by both Lindsay and Richard, the best way to measure impact really is to measure quantitative but also qualitative data. More and more media outlets understand that the number of clicks in a story is not really telling you if people are understanding your content, using your content to make decisions or to adapt their life, right? If it's truly making a difference. So it's for many media already, the time spent on page, for example, is more important than the number of clicks, right? Not to mention, of course, the reader comments, the discussions that you see happening online in forums or in social media to track the qualitative outcomes of your work. So not just quantitative data, but qualitative data, very important. And again, you have two examples there that can help you do this. One is the Impact Tracking Guide I mentioned previously. And the other one is an article on how Nature and the Bureau of Investigative Journalism measure the impact of their journalism, all with practical tips. I tried to find examples that are not going to take you too long to read. I can tell you the Impact Tracking Guide has about 25 pages, so all very friendly, and articles as well. You can go through that a bit quicker. And here it is. This is a screenshot of the guide that I'm recommending for you to have an idea. I think it's a very clean graphic. You can see that the scale goes from quantitative data that is easier to measure to more difficult data to measure, right? Which is the qualitative traditionally. So it's good to have a combination of both. And you can see examples there, the page views, the reach, the engagement, the conversions for everything that is measured through analytics. And there are free tools to do this. You don't always need to complicate. There are free tools online to do it, all the way to working with surveys, which is something, of course, that requires more time and dedication from the newsroom or from a journalist. So you have to weigh when it's better and when it's possible to use one and the other. Perhaps a survey makes sense for a multimedia series of stories, right? Something that it's really going to be important for your media outlet or for yourself as a journalist. But maybe for daily news, then it's easier to measure something with page views. It's not this clear cut. I'm just providing an example. And then another tip, the fourth one, track your outcomes, not just your outputs, right? So you need to think that your story is usually published online these days. We still have the paper, of course, but more and more we have digital native media outlets. The stories live online, right? They stay there. And very often the newsrooms and journalists tend to think, okay, now I'm going to move on to the next story. And I forget a little bit about the one I wrote previously or a year ago. But the stories live online. And right now the environment is truly competitive. So we're all struggling to get the attention of our readers, our communities, audiences, right? But you can imagine what life can these stories have after they went online. So what is the real world outcome of this story? Is there potential to transform this story, you know, into something that gets it closer to the audience? A theater play, a meeting, you know, a town hall committee to a town hall meeting to discuss the topic of the story, or even, you know, just an exhibition at a school. It all depends on who is your target audience and what is the impact that you want to achieve. Because sometimes this that we call now live journalism, taking the stories off the page and into the real world to be closer to the communities and the audiences, they can also have repercussions in terms of impact that are very strong, like policy changes or petitions or organized protests. And then this is an example, of course, I forgot to mention this one. So this is from Disclose. Disclose is a French, very small investigative media outlet who looks a lot at the impact of their work. And precisely, you will see there's something also close to the impact framework that Lindsay mentioned. So they are measuring impact at the institutional level, at the judicial level, but also looking at the public sphere and at the media. So has been, as the media replicated my work, is there more dissemination of our work as well to measure the impact of what they do. And these resources are all for free online. And then finally, another tip is, is building partnerships with other civic organizations. And again, many newsrooms are finding out that collaborating with nonprofits and advocacy groups is super important to amplify the impact of our journalism. This suggestion is met with mixed feelings, because journalists really work hard to create a distance between being what a journalist is and what an activist is, right? But when we talk about this partnership, is also with the understanding that after the story gets published, nonprofits can continue the work of pushing for societal change. And this is very important. So when we talked in the beginning about involving your communities earlier, before you set out to write a story or an investigation, also make sure that there is a representative of a nonprofit or an advocacy group, because they are usually experts on the topic. So they can be sources to your story, right? As long as there is a very clear line between their agenda and not having an agenda, I guess, right? Which is usually what journalists and newsrooms strive for. Some newsrooms are doing this in a very good way. And there is a department in CNN that is called As Equals. What they do is that they cover women's issues and policy change when it comes to gender equality in depth. And so they do this work very well. And again, the Bureau of Investigative Journalism. And CNN has published a zine, a very useful zine that you can see here. I just posted the images of how they go about doing this, how they organize, what they call listening groups with, people that have been affected by the topic they're covering, those that are potentially creating the issue, and also advocacy groups that are working on changing the situation. They bring them all together, and they use this even to find new story ideas. Sometimes the story is not planned yet, right? But is a topic of interest that they consider of interest. And so they work in this manner to define the agenda also for their media outlet. And that's it. So I want to leave you with these 5 very practical tips, and of course to invite you to follow the EJC in the networks where we are present. The best way to find out about our grants, about our programs, training programs, free resources is really by following the newsletter. It's just once a month. So we're not going to flood you with content. And yeah, thank you for listening. Of course, I'm very happy to answer questions you may have. And my email address is also there in case someone would like to follow up after the webinar.
Grazie Vera.
Thank you very much, Vera. Thank you. We really have a lot of information. And this information needs to be, of course, elaborated, let's say, because actually, so there's something new for many colleagues. Even if I remember that I participated in a panel where we had Lindsay and others 6 years ago in Perugia. That this is something that we not just started right now, but we need to, of course, to process all this content. Thank you so much for your intervention. Thank you so much for your contribution. Thank you for sending us your slides. That they can be probably a starting point of a series of questions that we can collect over time. So as a conclusion, after thanking you all, I'd like to give maybe the floor to Lauren, that is closing, and then our second session on impact journalist.
Molto bene, grazie Paolo.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Paolo. I'd like to thank you, all of you. I'd like to thank Filippo, Lindsay, Richard, and Vera. Thank you so much for your clear contents. I thank you also for showing us very practical examples. We still have just a couple of minutes to share my screen in order to show you this QR code. I would like to maybe to ask you if you want to scan it, and the QR code. This is just an assessment questionnaire on today's meeting. This is absolutely very important to have your feedback. That's the reason why we would like to write it in the chat as well, because if you don't have time to do it, that you can do it maybe later on. I'd like to give you some other information. in the next days, you will receive an email with all the materials of this training. Will give you the recording in Italian and in English of the whole meeting. We're going to send you also the slides that our speakers have shared with us. I would like also to thank you that we already have the Turin Impact Journalist online, and you can find all the and we have all the different recordings, and we have all different interventions and contributions. We have also the agenda for the next appointments. The next appointments are going to be then on the 11th of November. It's going to be impact journalism, stories that make a difference, and that we have a national and international experience with a lot of case studies. And the next will be on the 2nd of December, and we will see also then economic challenges that the news rooms needed to face in order to have an economic sustainability at long term. And the panel will be then focusing on building news rooms starting from scratch. So maybe you can write down your these days. We're going to give you some more information about that, and for the next webinars, all these training courses that will be available then on the platform for the next weeks, and then for the others, so you can follow Torino Social Impact on the websites and also on the social networks, so in order to be updated, to be posted on any new progress. Thank you so much for participation. Have a nice week. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.